There is a land where the wind carries echoes, as if ancient souls are still whispering through stone ridges and dusty fields, a place that holds more than just time. It holds something more elusive, questions that were never answered. On a quiet morning in 1945, beneath the thin desert light of Nag Hammadi, a group of farmers dug into the dry earth. They were not searching for gold, but they found something far more valuable, a broken clay jar buried for centuries, as if waiting for a hand that arrived by chance, but not by accident. Inside there was no treasure. There were manuscripts, written in Coptic, on fragile sheets of leather, carrying the voices of those once forced into silence. None of them knew they had touched a door, one that history had sealed shut. A door that led to fragments of soul, sacred words once whispered in the dark, once written as a way to hold on to light when the world had begun to close its eyes. The Gospels found in that jar were nothing like the familiar scriptures recited from pulpits. They didn't begin with halos or angels. They began with a quiet voice, deep, slow, almost like a whisper, meant only for those who were already doubting. There were no commands, no hellfire, no reward in heaven, just a single, soft question. What if the story we were told was only one chosen chapter? Among them was the Gospel of Thomas, filled with short sayings like coded sparks, the Gospel of Mary, where a woman stepped out from a role assigned to her and became a witness to something no one could explain. The Gospel of Judas, where the traitor became the one fulfilling the highest calling. And Philip, where Jesus spoke of the inner light and the mystery within himself. None of them matched the version of Jesus that had been standardized over 2,000 years. Not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. They didn't serve the project of order, and so they were left behind, torn away like pages from a letter no one was meant to read. But like all things buried deep, they found a way back. Even scorched, decaying, and incomplete, their words still carry weight. Not because they shout the truth, but because they don't need to. Their power lies in the silence between the lines, where the reader is invited to pause, to breathe, and to wonder, why have I never heard this before? These texts don't seek control, they don't try to convert. They simply awaken. And perhaps that's what makes them so dangerous. As sunlight filtered through those age-stained pages, the words didn't come alive, they continued, as if they had never died, as if every question, every doubt, every aching desire to understand who Jesus really was and what the spiritual path could truly mean had never left the human heart. They had only waited to be stirred again, gently, like desert dust lifting beneath the steps of someone finally returning. And from that moment, the journey began. Not a journey to find one final truth, but a willingness to accept that there may have always been more than one way to see the same light. Not to deny what has been believed, but to widen what we thought belief could hold, a movement toward the erased, the hidden, the forgotten, not to rebel against faith, but to seek it more deeply, to seek it more honestly, to seek it more humanly. This path offers no safety, it holds no clear conclusion, but once you've stood before the mouth of that broken jar, once the wind has carried the sound of forbidden voices to your ears, you can't go back. Not because you're being pulled forward, but because something deep within you has been awakened. And once you've touched the edge of that memory, every step you take afterward is forward. And when that question finally rises, why were only 4 Gospels kept? We begin to step into a maze of religious memory where light doesn't come from clear answers, but from flickers of truth glowing between forgotten lines. What haunts us isn't just the content of the Gnostic texts, it's their disappearance. No one can deny that once these writings were read, hand-copied, and spoken aloud in quiet gatherings lit by candlelight. The Gospel of Thomas, of Mary, of Philip, of Judas, each one offered a way of seeing Jesus, not as a distant God, but as a teacher who spoke in metaphor, in silence, in a glance you could only understand if you yourself had walked through doubt. Then came the selections. Not all at once, but over centuries. In the early days, when the faith was still fragile, people needed words that felt close, simple, easy to share. But as Christianity transformed, from a persecuted community into a rising political force, what couldn't be controlled became dangerous. Writings about intuition, about inner light, about the feminine divine Sophia, about the self being reborn within the soul, slowly were pushed to the margins, not because they were wrong, but because they couldn't be regulated. The decision to keep just 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wasn't only a theological move, it was political. It was the natural reaction of a movement trying to survive in a world built on power and empire. The other texts, with voices too personal, too strange, too hard to unify, didn't offer a strong enough foundation to convince the empire. And so they were left behind, not by decree, but through 1,000 quiet choices, not copied, not taught, not passed down. The danger wasn't in some grand conspiracy. It was in a process all societies go through, simplify to survive, cut away to make teaching easier, standardize to maintain order. But what's the cost of easier teaching? It's the loss of depth, the trimming away of edges that might hurt, but are also where the light bends most sharply. It's turning faith into something flat, predictable, and sometimes anemic. The communities that once cherished these texts, they didn't call themselves heretics, they didn't believe they were wrong, they just read differently, believed differently, lived differently. Maybe they sat in circles reading the hidden sayings of Jesus aloud, letting the meaning unfold slowly. Maybe they felt the divine not through rituals but through personal experience. Maybe women led their prayers. Maybe they didn't wait for salvation from above, but looked inward for transformation. They were real, they loved, they believed, and then they were left behind. 2,000 years later, those faint lines are beginning to breathe again. Not because of any official decree, but because some of us have started to ask, how much have we lost just because it didn't fit the system? And if truth really matters, why are we afraid to see the whole of its face, even the parts once hidden? So we keep walking, deeper into the journey, through the landscapes of those who once lived a faith more diverse than we imagined. People labeled heretics, perhaps only because they took a different path toward the same light. And now we begin to follow their footprints, through the dust of centuries, into the parts of memory that never had a name. Not everything that disappears is truly lost. Some things simply step back, waiting for someone quiet enough to notice, faithful enough to wonder, curious enough not to stop at what they've been taught. These texts, but the ones later labeled as heresy, apocrypha, non-canonical, weren't written to deny faith, but to expand it. They didn't come to tear down what had been built, but to remind us that no structure can ever fully contain the soul, and the soul always needs space to breathe. When we open the forgotten pages of these Gospels, what greets us isn't rebellion, and it's a different way to love truth, a truth that doesn't ask to be proven by logic, doesn't need protection through institutions, doesn't spread by fear. These writings are like fractured mirrors, and each shard reflecting a side of the human heart, imperfect, incomplete, but honest. And maybe that's why they were feared. In these texts, Jesus doesn't arrive to perform miracles or to appear as a towering figure demanding fear or worship. He shows up like a whisper, reminding us that the kingdom of God is within, that the light is not in temples or laws, but in the human capacity to question, to walk beyond fear, to believe in what the world calls foolish, that we might touch the sacred without anyone's permission. And maybe that's why those words were not preserved, not because they were wrong, but because they did not obey, they didn't submit, they weren't easy to teach, they weren't easy to control. A religion trying to stabilize itself couldn't afford ambiguity. An empire rising to power couldn't tolerate too much freedom. And so, what was too intimate, too abstract, too ungovernable, was pushed aside, not for its faults, but for its refusal to fit. Still, something in those writings refused to die. They survived not through dominance, but through those who believed in the beauty of spiritual diversity. People who copied them by hand, hid them in clay jars, tucked them into crevices in stone, not to win a debate, but to save a depth that was in danger of being swallowed. And because of them, we can still read these whispers, echoing through centuries of silence. Reading those words, we don't just see another faith, we glimpse another kind of person, another kind of Jesus, not to replace the one we know, but to complete the picture, to suggest that maybe in every gaze toward the divine, there's a fragment of truth. No fragment is enough on its own, but each one is precious, because if truth is an ocean, no one can hold it all. But if enough people bring their drops, we might feel the weight of its depth. So maybe the real question isn't which gospel is right. Maybe it's, why are we so afraid of truth having more than one shape? Could it be that our fear of losing control, of being wrong, of not having certainty, is what keeps us from a truth that is more alive, more flexible, more human? We're standing at a fracture. Not to break the old faith, but to look deeper into a structure that's been buried. Beneath the frozen surface of official history, there's a world waiting to be reborn. Not through argument, but through listening. Not to replace what we believe, but to see more clearly what we thought we already knew. And that door, it's still open. Slowly, quietly, but it cannot be closed. And if memory is a painting redrawn through the centuries, then Mary Magdalene was the first face to be blurred, not by forgetfulness, but by design. Her portrait was gradually erased, replaced with a version easier to manage, the sinful woman forgiven, living in gratitude, not the companion, not the guide, not the one who carried the memory of words never allowed to survive. But if we turn back to the old texts, without the lens of repentance, we find something else. Mary didn't stand at the margins. She stood as witness to what could not be captured in image or word. She held the last trace of light after all other lights had gone out. The gospel that bears her name is one of the rare texts that doesn't begin with outward events, but with inward movement. It isn't written through timelines, but through layers of spiritual experience. In its fragmented pages, Mary doesn't recount what happened. She shares what she understood. She speaks of the soul passing through 7 inner shadows to reach peace, not by blind faith, but by knowing. And that knowing isn't handed down from above, it rises from within. A journey inward that she not only walked, but dared to describe. And that changes everything. If salvation doesn't come from spilled blood or obedience, but from understanding, then who holds the right to teach? If a woman was the one who understood the teacher most deeply, can the gendered order built by religion still stand untouched? And if Jesus entrusted his most essential truth, to someone later dismissed by history, then maybe what was rejected wasn't just a person, but an entire path to the sacred that stood outside the boundaries of power. Mary Magdalene isn't just a misrepresented figure. She is a symbol of what was once pushed away from the center, not for lack of worth, but because her way of knowing didn't serve control. In a world where authority was tied to social status and gender, Mary carried a quiet revolution. The radical idea that spiritual insight doesn't care if you're male or female, ordained or not. All it asks for is a soul willing to listen. And that, to any system of power, is a dangerous idea. So the silence around her isn't just about missing pages or absent names in Scripture. It was a strategy, a long, deliberate effort to push an alternative model of faith out of view and replace it with something easier to define. The Holy One is the obedient one. The closer you are to God, the more you follow rank. But Mary stood for something else entirely, a direct, unmediated closeness to the divine. No temple needed, no ritual required, just truth. Is that why the last pages of the Gospel of Mary are gone? Is it possible that the most important part, where she might have shared the full words of the teachers, was exactly what time and power refused to preserve? What remains cuts off mid-sentence, like a breath interrupted. And in that fracture, there's an echo, not of completion, but of something left unfinished. A quiet invitation to keep going, not to prove anything, but to rediscover what was once quietly turned away. Maybe it wasn't just Mary. Maybe there were others who once heard the same whisper, who carried a piece of truth in their hearts, who held it in silence, then were told to forget. But memory, true memory, is never fully lost as long as someone is willing to return and read again. Not to stir rebellion, but to touch a different kind of light, a gentler kind, a deeper kind, and maybe a truer kind. A voice rises from the depths of a condemned memory, not the voice of a saint or of someone who understood the teacher, but the voice of a betrayer. Judas Iscariot. For 2,000 years he has stood as the symbol of treachery, the dark stain on the canvas of divine love. But what if the forgotten texts once gave him a different role? What if Judas, in a fragment of memory forced to fall to the bottom, was actually the one entrusted with the most terrifying task? Not because he betrayed, but because he was trusted. The Gospel of Judas, a text only brought to light in the early 21st century, reveals a completely different perspective. In it, Judas does not betray Jesus out of greed, not out of anger, but because Jesus chose him, because he was the only one who understood enough to carry out what no one else dared to do, to deliver the teacher into the hands of those who would kill him, so the divine plan could be fulfilled. In this version, Jesus is not a victim. He is in control. He knows what is coming, and he tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them. You will sacrifice the man that clothes me, so that I may be lifted up." It's a different kind of story. Now, it's not about guilt, but about sacred complicity, not about betrayal, but about the understanding between two souls. If this is true, then the whole moral foundation of loyalty and betrayal starts to blur. And that blur, that grayness, is exactly what religious structures fear most. Because the system needs clarity, good guys and bad guys, heaven and hell, right and wrong. But texts like Thomas and Judas offer something else entirely, a spiritual path that doesn't divide but deepens. Not judgment, but awareness. Thomas, Judas, Mary. 3 names, 3 shadows pushed out of the official light. But if you read the texts carefully, you'll see something they share. They didn't conform, they didn't just repeat what someone else taught them, they asked questions. They received truth in their own way, and accepted the cost. That's why the writings associated with them don't lead you into a system of belief. They lead you into a place where truth isn't handed down from above, but rises up from within. Jesus, in these writings, is not the keeper of exclusive truth, but the one inviting you into the depths. He doesn't want worship from afar. He wants to be understood in silence, in presence, in a light no one else can define for you. And that is why these words were silenced. If Thomas was the one who dared to see clearly, if Mary was the one who dared to hold on to what had been denied, then Judas was the one who dared to carry the role that would always be misunderstood, so that a deeper truth might unfold. None of them are easy to grasp, but maybe that's exactly why they deserve to be heard now more than ever. And now, as we let these texts speak again, not to tear down faith, but to expand it, the biggest question is no longer who was right. The better question might be, well, what have we missed in our search for a truth we thought was already complete? And behind that question, there is still a voice waiting to be heard, not out there somewhere, but perhaps in the deepest part of ourselves. But it didn't fade without leaving echoes, because in the ashes of religious history, sometimes it's what was burned that ends up shining the brightest, not with fire, but with the thin trails of smoke still lingering in human memory. The Gospel of Judas, like a stone turned over after 2,000 years, reveals not just a hidden story, but a parallel current of theology, one that was once alive, once read, once believed by a real community that once walked this earth. They left no seminaries, no cathedrals, no political power, but they left something that couldn't be erased by bans or flames, a different lens, a different way of seeing God, of seeing betrayal, of seeing salvation. Not as a framed picture, but as a mirror, pixies with more than one side. And in that mirror, figures like Judas begin to come into focus, no longer just symbols of moral failure, but reflections of a different kind of courage. The courage to carry hatred, misunderstanding, and centuries of silence. The Gospel of Judas doesn't offer paradise, it doesn't comfort, it doesn't simplify. It's a fracture, a distant echo from the edge of official memory. And for that very reason, it's a deeply real part of a faith that was once far more layered than what we're usually told. The communities that held this gospel were once branded heretics, erased, forgotten. But they weren't alone. They were part of a larger current, the Gnostics, who believed that truth can't be imposed from the outside, only recognized from within. For them, to truly understand and act, like the act of Judas, you had to look beyond moral surface masks and touch the deeper layers, intention, knowing, devotion. And sometimes what looks like betrayal may have been the final faithful act, one no one else could understand except the one chosen to carry it. It's no surprise this text was cast aside, no surprise the church never wanted to face a Judas like this, because if he didn't betray, then who did? If he wasn't wrong, then where does the wrong lie? And if the whole truth isn't a straight line but a complex circle, what ground does faith stand on?
Maybe we'll never have a full answer, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the very act of questioning and the right to keep asking is the true gift these buried texts give us. They don't hand us boxed up truth. They hand us a torn and faded map, but a real one, where faces like Thomas, Mary, Judas, and others, whose names we may never know, once lit a different path.
A path that didn't pass through power, didn't pass through dogma, but moved soul by soul, through those brave enough to hear what no one was saying, to believe what no one was teaching, and to hold on to what everyone thought had been lost. And because of them, the story isn't closed. It's still shifting, quietly, from the stone walls of orthodoxy back to the dust where every truth once began. And in their silence, something still refused to vanish. The Gospel of Philip, fragmented, symbolic, and at times so cryptic it feels like it comes from another world, was never meant to explain. It breathes, it lives. It lingers like a half-open door into a sacred experience built not on blind belief, but on direct perception, and as if light itself cannot be described, only walked through, touched, and felt in the marrow of the soul. In this view, every symbol, from the wedding garment used in the union of soul and spirit to calling Mary the sacred companion of Jesus, isn't just metaphor, but instruction. For readers ready to move beyond the stories and into themselves. Philip did not write to preach. He offered no system. He didn't argue or persuade. Instead, he set down a mirror, dense with symbols, and stepped into the shadows, allowing the reflection to guide the journey inward. In that mirror, gender dissolves. Male and female are seen as two poles of energy that must reunite, not in flesh but in essence, not in carnal passion, as later misreading suggested, but in the healing of a metaphysical split that happened at the beginning of time. In this light, every soul becomes the dwelling place of a divine presence, not from above, but from within the harmony of the self. There is no original sin in the Gospel of Philip, no threats of hellfire, no image of a wrathful God, only a quiet call to return. To return to a wholeness lost when humanity drifted away from its sacred essence. And if salvation is no longer a reward, but a remembering, a reawakening of what's already inside, then the whole machinery of intermediaries, the entire structure built on the distance between God and man, begins to lose its grip. And maybe that's why this text was set aside, because it gives no one power. It doesn't build walls. There's no us and them, no inside or outside. It's a key, but one that only the individual can use to open the door within. It's a kind of faith that can't be controlled. And in a world obsessed with order, that was something that couldn't be allowed. The Gospel of Philip, then, is like a narrow beam of light slipping through a crack in stone. Not enough to light the whole cave, but enough to hint that there's something vast still hidden inside. It's a living theology, breathing through metaphor, asking to be felt not by logic, but by the full depth of consciousness. It isn't for everyone, but for those ready, it's a map. A map pointing to a forgotten community who once believed that divine knowledge couldn't be contained in books, only in the movement of the soul. And slowly, we begin to see it more clearly. This entire forgotten current, with Philip as one of its most poetic voices, wasn't heresy. It was a copy of a faith that had never been boxed in. A spirituality grounded not in control, but in connection, not in doctrine, but in feeling. And when that path was sealed off, those who carried it had to step back, not because they were wrong, but because the world wasn't ready to understand something that could never be grasped with the hands, only recognized by the heart. Perhaps what made Gnosis most dangerous was that it could never be possessed, never controlled, never handed down from above. Because Gnosis was never a doctrine to believe, it was an experience to be lived. In that world, power didn't belong to the preacher, but to the listener's own heart. And for that reason, no one could claim absolute authority. It was a structure far too fluid for any church looking to stabilize its foundation, to merge faith with politics. In this order, light did not descend through standardized sermons, but rose from within, through intuition, through symbol, through the innate human ability to touch the sacred without needing anyone to stand in between. The Gnostics didn't see the world as a battlefield of good versus evil, but as a maze where the soul had lost its way because it forgot where it came from. They didn't see sin as a stain to be washed away with blood, but as a fog to be lifted through understanding. And that understanding for them wasn't something you memorized, was something you remembered. A remembering that we are light wrapped in matter. That what we call reality, money, power, even religion itself, is only a shadow of something deeper, farther, more real. So when Jesus, in the Gnostic text, says, "If you were born from the light, then you have seen the light," he is not asking for worship, he is inviting recognition. And that, in any era, is the hardest thing to control. Because it bypasses every middleman, every authority. It asks for no permission. It simply waits for someone to pause and ask, "Who am I really?" In that light, no church is large enough, no law is wide enough, no system is strong enough to hold the soul in place. And that is the most terrifying thing to those who need order to remain unshaken. Because gnosis, like a small flame in the wind, may be overwhelmed but never extinguished. It may vanish from the center, but it hides in every crack of time, in every lost manuscript, in every breath passed down by those who once dared to live the truth. Not through dogma, but through presence. Isn't it strange that after nearly 2,000 years, those words are still here? Burned, buried, forgotten, and still breathing. Stranger still that we are still listening. Because maybe somewhere inside us there is a piece of light that was once forgotten, waiting to be remembered. A part of us that once knew and had to go silent because the world no longer allowed it to speak. Now, as the fallen fragments are gathered again, as the communities once labeled heretical emerge like old branches beneath the dust, we aren't just rereading history, we're rereading our own question: what is truth really? And that question once again brings us to the fragile edge between what the world once called dangerous and what might just be the deepest part of the human soul. The part that never agreed to stay silent. A system cannot survive if each person is allowed to touch the sacred in their own way. A system endures only when the sacred is packaged, distributed, and regulated by a class of people empowered to define right and wrong, true and false, in and out. And in such a world, gnosis, with its inner light that needs no mediator, becomes something deeply threatening. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't serve the kind of power that was being built, the power to control memory. By the end of the 2nd century, Gnostic writings began disappearing from mainstream communities. They weren't burned in sweeping public flames. They were set aside, quietly, through sharp reasoning, formal declarations of heresy, and warnings about spiritual error. Bit by bit, the diverse web of early Christian belief was tightened into a single trunk. The side branches, once home to mystic thought, spiritual experience, and questions too deep for doctrine, were trimmed away. And the truth, once a vast ocean of many currents, was pressed into a single river flowing through the gate of the church. The real power didn't lie only in rejecting texts like those of Thomas, Philip, Mary, or Judas. It was in redefining the very shape of faith, transforming it from a personal journey full of questions into a standardized belief system with clear rules, hierarchies, and checkpoints. From then on, anyone who stepped outside the frame wasn't just wrong. They were dangerous, not to the soul, but to the structure being formed. And that structure, once bound to empire, to Rome, to politics, grew too large to turn back. By the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine officially embraced Christianity and summoned the Council of Nicaea, a new door opened. Not the mystical door of gnosis, but the institutional gate of power. For the first time in history, faith was shaped by decree. Scriptures were chosen, canons were named, doctrines were locked in place, and whatever didn't fit simply vanished, not through instant violence, but through neglect, through silence, through the slow disappearance of texts never copied again. There was no need to argue with gnosis anymore. Just don't speak of it, don't teach it, don't pass it down. Let the words fade beneath the sand, and let time do the rest. And yet, strangely, time couldn't erase the light. It only made the light retreat, waiting for someone to see it again. When those texts were unearthed nearly 2,000 years later, we didn't just recover fragments of parchment. We recovered a question that has no easy answer, but is quiet enough to still the room. Can true faith ever be boxed in? Can the truth really wear just one face? And in our deep yearning to understand the sacred, did we lose something precious simply because we accepted a system that chose too quickly and silenced too strongly? And if anything from those forgotten writings still breathes today, it is this: our capacity to ask again, the courage to step outside old definitions, the memory that light once appeared in many places at once. And maybe, just maybe, that's the first step toward reading history with new eyes, not through the lens of power, but through the heart of those still listening in silence. And that fire wasn't just a symbol, it was a brutal truth that burned through the centuries after the Council of Nicaea. Once the structure of faith had been shaped, anything that threatened its foundation became a danger, and was treated as such. Writings once cherished in quiet communities, where the sacred was shared through direct experience, were now hunted, gathered, and burned. But it wasn't just books that were set on fire, it was memory. It was the right to ask questions. It was the freedom to feel truth in ways that didn't match the majority. From the 4th to the 5th century, the persecution of so-called heretical groups grew more ruthless. Gnostic communities, which had once stretched from Egypt to the Levant, were slowly pushed into the shadows. And then silence. Texts that carried the breath of spiritual freedom, the Gospel of Thomas, Philip, Mary, Judas, were either destroyed or hidden in caves, deserts, and clay jars, just to escape the tightening grip of a system becoming more totalitarian in spirit. This was no longer a matter of theological disagreement. It was a matter of power and memory, because memory is the only thing that can preserve a sacred experience once the system has denied it. And memory, if it's not copied, spoken, passed down, begins to fade, then disappears. The truth didn't need to be crushed with violence. It only needed to be ignored, left out, left unnamed. The death of memory is a quiet death, but one that lasts longer than fire. What remained was a single image, one Jesus, one teaching, one Bible, all framed within an order, built by power. Rituals were standardized, the role of the priest elevated. The congregation taught obedience, not exploration. And faith, once a wild journey into the unknown in search of light, was now a paved road with fixed milestones and licensed guides, and yet that very perfection was its deepest weakness, because when an ideology claims to hold all the truth, it must carry the full weight of that truth alone, and if even a hairline crack appears, the whole structure can shatter. That's why the other texts were hunted so fiercely, not because they were dangerously wrong, but because they could make people start asking questions again. And the right question, asked at the right moment, can expose something buried for centuries. The fires that burned those books were the fires of fear. Fear that people might read what they were not supposed to. Fear that inner light, once awakened, would no longer need the light handed down by the church. Fear that someone, sitting alone in silence, might feel the sacred without anyone telling them how. But memory, like desert sand, is often only buried, not gone. And in 1945, when a clay jar cracked open in the hot earth of Nag Hammadi, a hairline fracture appeared in the glass of official history. From that crack, the light began to leak. Not a blazing light, but something softer, quieter, like breath from a time when faith was still whispered, not defined, and it's that light that leads us now into the next chapter of this journey, where the so-called heresies, the burned pages, the forgotten names, still wait to be read again, not to replace the old truth, but to deepen it. And from the edges of the institution, they did not shout. They did not form new sects or proclaim a new truth. They simply held on, held the broken fragments of memory, held the handwritten texts others had forgotten or feared, held a way of understanding that needed no approval, no validation. These were people whose names never made it into official history, who left no statues or relics behind. And yet, because of them, the earliest questions were never fully lost. These small groups lived beneath the noise of pulpits and councils. They didn't argue with the church or attempt to overthrow its structure. They simply chose not to forget. In quiet rooms, in distant deserts, in remote monasteries, they read the words once forbidden. They copied them by hand, silently, patiently, and when the world shifted, when empires fell, when cities were set ablaze, those texts did not vanish with them, because they were never kept in the center of power. They survived in the margins, in sand, in caves, in the memory of those never officially recognized. That's why when the Gnostic texts resurfaced after nearly 2,000 years, as if returning from another world, we weren't just encountering a different theology. We were hearing the echo of a memory that had almost been extinguished, a memory that served no political purpose, that reinforced no clerical hierarchy, that built no system of control. It only whispered there is another way to understand the sacred, a way that doesn't feed on fear, but rises through awareness. That kind of understanding may not be certain, may not be consistent, may not lend itself easily to structure, but that is what makes it real. It is closer to the human soul, to the things we cannot name with rules. It allows ambiguity, multiplicity, individuality. It does not box belief into doctrine. It opens space for each person to find their own light, even if that light is small, flickering, fragile. And maybe that is why these texts were once set to flame, because they weren't afraid of uncertainty. They accepted that the path to the sacred is never identical, never linear, never entirely clear. They didn't tell us where to go, they taught us how to begin. They made no promises, they offered freedom. In today's world, where control no longer wears the robes of ancient churches but hides in other forms, media, algorithms, collective dogma, these texts return like a mirror. They remind us that the inner light is still there, that a path does not have to be sanctioned to be real, that the sacred can appear in places no one thinks to look, and that sometimes faith survives not because it's protected, but because it's forgotten just long enough to stay untouched. The keepers of memory never won the game of power, but because of them, something was never entirely lost. And now, as we read these once buried, once banned, once burned texts, we are no longer just studying the past. We are answering an invitation to remember, to ask again, to listen more deeply, and maybe, just maybe, to begin again. And because they buried them, we now have the chance to listen again. Not as those hearing a sermon, but as someone standing in the night, pulling back an old veil and seeing, faint, flickering, a few forgotten lights still burning. The scrolls hidden in clay jars at Nag Hammadi, Egypt, buried for over 1,000 years, were not discovered by historians, bishops, or kings. They were found by farmers, ordinary people, invisible to official history. And yet their hands were the first to awaken a memory that had once been set on fire. Inside those jars was an entire world that had been forced into silence. Not just Gospels named after Mary, Thomas, Philip, or Judas, but a rich spectrum of belief, of questions, of symbols, from mystical meditations to sharp dialogues on the nature of the soul and humanity. There was no hierarchy in those pages, no language of force, only the quiet voices of those who once lived in a light that needed no permission, no proof, no approval. These texts, many torn, many lines missing, do not give us a complete story, but perhaps that's what makes them more real. They bear the shape of human memory, fragmented, fragile, and yet deep enough never to fully vanish. And when placed alongside what became official, they do not contradict. They expand, as if to say, there was never just one road that led to the sacred. What made these writings dangerous was not what they said, it was the quiet truth that truth itself need not be singular, that one teaching could be held in many understandings, that the human soul cannot be standardized, and that the sacred may dwell in silence, in doubt, in dialogue, not only within the boundaries of doctrine. And because of that, the entire structure of power built around a single faith had to erase these writings, not through argument, but through disappearance, so that history could be written as if no other paths had ever been taken. But history, no matter how tightly controlled, can never be fully sealed, because there are always people, uncelebrated, unnamed, who choose to keep what others call unnecessary. A copy, a handwritten margin note, a strange, forgotten symbol, small seeds buried in time, not meant to win, only to survive. Waiting for another age, one in which the questions once burned might be asked again. And that survival, that patient silence, is proof that memory is not easily erased, so long as someone is still willing to search, still willing to listen. In the end, the true power of memory does not lie in its echo, but in its ability to endure, even when no longer spoken aloud. And once it returns, as it does now, rising gently from the ashes of time, we do not simply see the past, we see ourselves. And all that might have been different, if only we had not forgotten. And when that forgotten world began to speak again, time itself seemed to hold its breath, not because what was found was loud, but because it was so silent, a silence not born of absence, but of depth, as if each word, each symbol, each torn fragment of paper was a remaining drop from a rain that once soaked the human soul. A rain long forgotten, but never truly gone. When the first scholars opened the manuscripts from Nag Hammadi, they didn't just find a string of letters, they felt a warmth passing through centuries of forgetting. The words they read were unlike anything known from the established Bible. They didn't tell stories in straight lines, they didn't ask for belief in the traditional sense. Instead, they were like doorways, not opening outward into the world, but inward into the reader. Some felt confused, others felt as if they were remembering something they had never learned, but always known. That is the essence of gnosis, not knowledge to be taught, but memory being stirred, like a spark rising again when it meets the wind, not to burn down, but to illuminate the forgotten corners that had been buried under dogma, power, and time. In those texts we see familiar faces, Mary, Thomas, Philip, Judas, but not as rigid icons of orthodox theology. They appear as people with contradictions, with emotion, with a yearning to understand and touch the sacred without needing anyone to stand between. And in them, there is something deeply human, something startlingly close to us today, still wandering through the maze of doctrine, belief systems, and a silent hunger for truth. When the jar was opened, it didn't just unlock an ancient archive, it unlocked the possibility that history could be written differently, not to erase what already existed, but to complete the picture with pieces that had once been cast aside, to understand that faith doesn't have to follow a single line. It can be a radiant circle with many centers, many paths, many voices, all reaching towards something that cannot be named. And when those texts began to be translated, printed, and shared, no longer forbidden, but seen as something worth rediscovering, the work of the anonymous firekeepers was finally fulfilled. They did not live to see the words they preserved be heard or understood, but they believed one thing, that true knowing does not need to win right away. It only needs a place to wait. And perhaps this very moment, as the light from those ancient writings begins to reach the minds of a modern world adrift in noise already, and is when that fire truly returns, not as a revolution, but as a quiet reminder that there was once a kind of knowing we were told to forget. And now it is simply waiting for us to be still enough to remember. And when we look back at what was kept alive, then the fragmented remnants of a faith once dismissed as heresy, the handwritten text hidden in the deepest corners of time, we realize something quietly astonishing. The miracle isn't just in what they say, but in the journey they survive just to still exist. A journey through centuries of fear, through fires of censorship, through political storms, and through the forgetfulness of those who once believed in them. Theodora didn't rewrite history, but she did something history rarely remembers. She made space, a space for what didn't belong to official memory, to keep breathing. And in doing so, she gave forgotten truths a place to take root again. She didn't challenge doctrines, she didn't tear down the church. But in an age where silence meant consent, her decision to protect what was endangered became its own quiet declaration. She chose not to erase. And so when we read today the words of the Gospel of Mary, or the questions of Thomas, or the strange metaphors woven through Philip, we don't just see their contents, we see the trembling hands that once copied them. We feel the cautious glance cast before unrolling the scroll. We sense the quiet will of those like Theodora, who made sure not everything would vanish. That is why the Gnostic texts, even in their incomplete state, still stir something deep in the modern reader, not only because of what they say, but because they so nearly never had the chance to say it. Each line is a miracle of survival, each symbol a trace of another world, indeed a world where truth didn't arrive in proclamations, but in quiet recognitions within the heart. And at the end of that road, dusty, forbidden, and nearly lost to time, we find something unexpectedly simple. There were people who lived without needing to win. They didn't need to be declared orthodox. They didn't need to be proven right. They simply believed that knowledge was never meant to be burned. And because of that quiet faith, we can still hear the whispers of what was once buried. Perhaps in listening now, we're not just reading history. We are living part of it. The part that was pushed into silence but never truly went dark. Because of people like Theodora. Because of those who hid scrolls in the sand. Because of questions no one dared ask aloud, but which never stopped echoing in the soul. And so the light, it was never taken away. It was simply kept, waiting for us to return when we are no longer afraid of the questions, when we are quiet enough to hear the answers that were never allowed to be spoken. And in that moment, when the torn fragments of ancient paper begin to join as if they had always been waiting for this. We're no longer just reading old texts. We're reopening a conversation that was once interrupted, a quiet dialogue between souls separated by thousands of years, yet bound by the same longing to understand and to be understood. These voices don't shout, they whisper, they rise from the deepest place within, a place no doctrine can touch, where only lived experience becomes a true language. And perhaps that's why they were once feared, because every system has its limits, and voices that come from within, unpredictable, uncontainable, tend to break those limits. They follow no diagrams, they don't rebuild the world using the old order. They open a door, and once that door is opened, it cannot easily be closed. That door doesn't lead to a new ideology. It leads back to an old terrain, a place where belief had not yet been divided into right or wrong, where the sacred was something you felt, not something you memorized. This is what the Gnostic texts awaken, not a rebellion, not a counter-system, but a quiet reminder that there was once a time, and maybe there still are places within the mind, where the soul didn't need permission to believe, to search, to love something deeper than what was being taught, where the sacred was not a location, but a breath, a glance, a moment of recognition. And in the world we live in today, crowded with voices, filled with noise, shaped by structures trying to reassemble meaning, the return of these once-burned texts is not a controversy, it is an opportunity, an opening to ask again the questions we've forgotten how to ask, an invitation to return to a faith not confined by systems, but one that grows like a flame from the act of touching the sacred for the very first time. No intermediaries, no fear. The silence that once stretched long as night now becomes the backdrop that allows this light to appear more clearly. A light not born from authority, but from forgotten lines buried in wind-blown earth. Not from victory in debate, but from the patience of those who chose to preserve what they believed the future might need. And now, as those scattered pieces begin to take shape once again from a shattered clay jar, a forgotten library, a sentence once misplaced, they do more than remind us of the past. They invite us to step into a part of ourselves we thought was gone, a part that was never lost, only waiting to be called again. With a whisper, and with a question so ancient no one has yet answered it fully. If truth was once set on fire, then what kind of flame will bring it back? And so, what was once hidden beneath stone, beneath fear, beneath the architecture of power, finally found its way back, not with the sound of trumpets, but with the faint rustle of a human hand brushing against an old scroll. The beginning of that return didn't come from an academy. It wasn't born in a cathedral. It started on a dry, sun-scorched hill where life seemed to have long since withdrawn. And yet from there, an entire layer of memory began to bloom. The Nag Hammadi collection is not just a library of ancient texts. It is physical proof that history is never flat. Each page, each time-worn line is the scar of a hidden current, a theology that once ran parallel, only to be forced underground. And when we read the opening lines of the Gospel of Thomas, or the Gospel of Mary, or the Revelation of James, we are not merely encountering a different manuscript. We are stepping into an alternate dimension of the soul. What makes these texts profound is not how new they are, but how anciently familiar. They don't seek to reconstruct theology upon the foundation of orthodoxy. They move in another direction, inward, toward the memory of light already within us, toward a path that does not pass through intermediaries. These writings do not command, they awaken. And in a modern world saturated with voices molded by systems, that gentle awakening drifts in like an unfamiliar wind. No one knows how many such texts once existed, how many were burned, shattered, overwritten in silent palimpsests, but the presence of the Nag Hammadi library is its own quiet testimony that not all was lost, and sometimes all it takes is a fracture, a single slip in the timeline of history, for light to filter back in, for a forgotten seed to break through stone and begin again to grow. This kind of resurrection doesn't ask anyone to abandon faith. It does not seek to negate. It deepens. It reminds us that there once was a Christianity before the creeds, a time when people were still allowed to feel Jesus not as a definition, but as a living experience, a whisper that touched something wordless at the core of being. And the strange truth is, these texts are not opposed to Christianity. They do not mock belief. They simply open another door, where salvation does not come through punishment, but through recognition, where truth is not a weapon to exclude, but a journey of return. A journey anyone can begin, so long as they still carry the question in their heart. Nag Hammadi was not a miracle. It was a murmur, a stubborn memory that refused to be erased. And in today's world, thick with noise, perhaps the only thing we need in order to hear it is just enough silence, enough to realize that beneath the dust another map is being revealed, one that does not just point us toward belief, but gently leads us home. And in that very pause, where a sentence breaks off mid-thought, something strange happens. The reader is no longer just a recipient, but becomes the continuation. Not by adding more words, but by allowing silence. Not to write a new ending, but to listen more deeply. Because some truths can only be understood when we are still enough to hear them. That is how the Gnostic texts quietly break the usual rules of theology. They do not end with declarations. They end with resonance. They do not hand over a truth. They open a space for you to step into and find your own. These ancient writings do not offer creeds. They do not insist, this is the truth. They simply whisper, look again. And in a world trained to crave clarity, obsessed with a single correct answer, that gentle invitation becomes the most radical act of all. It is what makes scholars uneasy, not because they are convinced, but because they are unsettled, because they must ask questions they thought they had already answered, because they begin to see that the history of belief may not be a single river, but a wide delta, with many branches that were buried not because they were false, but because they could not be controlled. These texts, from Mary, from Thomas, from Philip, never claim finality. They do not build new religions, but in each line, each image, each deliberate silence between the sentences, they shift the center of gravity from institutional authority to personal experience. They remind us that the sacred path, before it is a doctrine, is first an inward journey, and so they do not argue. They place a mirror and ask only this: are you willing to look? Faced with that, the Church chose a detour, for no creed was ever written to hold uncertainty, and within a system built on certainty, ambiguity is the most dangerous substance of all. But for those whose faith had grown brittle, for those who found their prayers hollow, these texts feel like a different kind of breath, not loud, not commanding, but real. And when questions from the 2nd century are finally heard again in the voice of the 21st, we begin to understand perhaps what has been missing for centuries is not a paragraph, not a dogma, not a forgotten ritual, but a space. A space to wonder, a space to doubt, a space to be lost and not be punished for it. Perhaps the most sacred thing is not a voice, but the silence between voices. And perhaps these once banned texts are trying to teach us this, that truth does not always live in what is spoken, but in the courage to keep listening to what has never yet been said. So in the end, we do not read these texts with our eyes alone. We read them with the quiet within us, with the unspoken reply from the depths of the soul. As if every unfinished sentence, every open-ended thought was an ancient way of saying, "The rest is not in the scroll. The rest is in you." And from that torn sentence, a new branch begins to grow, right in the old soil where no one expected anything to live. The absence at the end of the Gospel of Mary does not weaken it. On the contrary, it turns the text into a fracture, and through it, light enters. Not the kind of light that blinds with absolute truth, but the kind that forces the reader to adjust their own eyes. The real question isn't what did Mary say, but why was Mary's voice taken? And if someone trusted by the teacher could be pushed to the edge of the story, how many other truths have been lost that we never even knew to ask for? The text does not argue for its own authority. It does not use power to make its case. It leaves behind something far more human: confusion, fear, and a woman standing in the middle of it all, not to claim control, but to recall what was given to her in a language that needs no enforcement. And that is what unsettles both the disciples in the story and the readers today, because it does not follow the usual order. It does not assign authority based on position, but on understanding. And understanding, as Mary shows, does not come from social role, but from inner awakening. What's missing from the manuscript is not just content, but the chance to glimpse another kind of structure. A sacred framework where spiritual knowledge is not defined by rank or title, but by depth of perception. A worldview in which a woman is not just a witness, but a bearer of the word. And so the missing ending is not just a gap, it's an accusation, a silent one, a reminder that history sometimes chose to be quiet precisely when it should have spoken. Mary does not resist with logic. She simply tells. And that act of telling, made so plain, so unguarded, is what frightens power. Because a story that was never supposed to exist is the story that can change the way everything is defined. And so it was not debated, it was cut, like a clean slice through the flesh of the manuscript, leaving only dried blood behind and no trace of what once flowed. But strangely, it is that very rupture that makes the gospel feel more alive, because the reader can no longer remain passive. They must confront the silence, they must lean in, they must imagine, must ask, must try to hear a voice that was erased, and in doing so, they begin to do what the text quietly invites, to turn inward, where the sacred no longer needs pages to exist, but lives like a whisper in the soul. Mary's voice, then, is not a silence that ends. It is an echo, a reverberation, small but persistent. A line that was never finished, and because of that is always still here, waiting to be heard again, not to win a debate, but to remind us that other ways of knowing once existed, were lived, were trusted, were passed on with love, but were never allowed to be told through to the end. And from that moment, the search continues. Not just in museums, not just on research tables, but inside the hearts of those weary of truths that no longer breathe. Hearts learning how to listen again, beginning with the things that were taken away. And that is what makes the journey backwards so much more complex than anyone ever imagined. Because it wasn't only the rejected texts that bear the fingerprints of manipulation. Even those we've kept, cherished, printed by the millions through centuries, are no longer as untouched as we were led to believe. Every line in the Bible, whether in Greek, in Latin, or in modern translations, has passed through hundreds of human hands. Copied, corrected, updated, trimmed, replaced. Not always out of deceit, but often because humans, keep trying to reorder what lies beyond their understanding. Bart Ehrman once pointed out no two ancient manuscripts of the New Testament are exactly alike. Over 400,000 differences have been recorded between them, more than the number of words in the entire New Testament. Some are innocent mistakes, but others were deliberate changes, verses that elevate the divinity of Jesus, added later. Puzzling phrases, softened. Contradictions, cleaned up. And each edit, however small, became another layer of paint covering the original, until we could no longer say for sure what lay underneath. Scholars like Pagels, Ehrman and Meyer don't only talk about the texts that were lost, they also reveal how even the official ones have long carried the scars of revision. And that's what makes the claim of an inerrant Bible so fragile, not because faith is false, but because faith was built on ground that's always shifting, rewritten to meet the needs of empire, of era, of control. What's unsettling is not the mistakes themselves, it's the silence around them. For centuries, these changes were not discussed, not taught, not allowed to be questioned. And those who noticed them were often accused of undermining belief, so much so that merely asking a question became a rebellious act. But once those questions are asked, and asked not just by outsiders, but by those who were trained within the very heart of the system, there is no going back to the old peace. No pretending that what we've inherited is seamless, untouched, or unanimous. The chorus of contradictions is no longer hypothetical, it's real. Rising now from the unearthed sands, the fading manuscripts, and the quiet persistence of those who dare to study what was meant to stay hidden. This does not destroy faith, it simply makes it impossible for faith to remain sealed in a fixed shape, and in that opening some feel lost, but others feel lighter, and because now they no longer have to pretend to believe in something that was never as pure as it seemed. That in the end may be the deepest meaning of this movement, to recover erased memory, not to replace one truth with another, but to give the world of belief space to breathe again, to be questioned, to be lived as a river finding its course, not as a statue locked in the town square of history. Because ultimately what these scholars, or those who walk between both sides of the boundary, are trying to say is not don't believe, but rather look closer at what you think you already know, because the part that was torn from the page may be the part missing from your own soul. And if you follow its trace long enough, even among the pages that were never banned, you may still find the hand that intervened, and the place where silence was made. And when these returning voices began asking who had the right to tell the story, another truth rose from the depths like a long-forgotten current. It wasn't just the content that had been distorted, but the very language itself. The seemingly neutral tool of transmission was where power had hidden most deeply. What we call the Word of God today, the verses of the Bible, the doctrines preached as infallible, are in reality the end result of centuries of translation, revision, and hand-copied alteration. And in that long journey, a single mistranslation or a single word choice that leaned ever so slightly toward authority could reroute the spirit of an entire message. Take the Greek word metanoia. In its original form, it meant something soft, intimate, a change of mind, a turning inward, a process of transformation. But once filtered through Latin, in the language of the Western Church, it became penitentia, penance, sorrow for sin, and then, in English, simply repent. What began as a gentle invitation to awaken became a command shaded with guilt, just one word. And yet, the entire tone of the sacred changed, or ecclesia, a word that once simply meant assembly or gathering. Over time it became church, not a living community but an institution, a structure, a hierarchy with sacred authority. And so what was once a circle of souls drawn together in search of light gradually hardened into walls, altars, titles, and the living flame of faith became a system to be administered. Translation, or more precisely, translation with intent, does not need to be obvious to be powerful. It only needs to happen consistently, subtly, and in the right places. Once the original Greek, Hebrew, or Coptic becomes inaccessible, the translation itself becomes the original in the collective mind. A metaphorical teaching of Jesus might now be read as a literal command. A poetic image about light and the inner self could be flattened into a moral instruction, and in this way the sacred becomes rigid, not from malice, but from the instinct to control, to defend against what cannot be caged. Language doesn't just carry meaning, it shapes belief. In the hands of those who understand the weight of a word, an entire theology can shift by altering the order of a phrase, adjusting a pronoun, or removing a clause, and slowly what once stirred the soul like a whisper from within is replaced by a system of creeds, efficient, repeatable, but distant from lived experience. It wasn't until the lost text began to resurface, written in untouched Greek, in raw Coptic, not yet edited by later ecclesiastical hands, that scholars could compare and begin to see. Not one or two ideas had been skewed, but entire frameworks of divine understanding had been reconstructed to serve a system. And if that's true, we must ask, is what we now call truth still carrying the shape of what was first spoken, or just the outer shell of something that once felt very different? That question, once asked, cannot be withdrawn. It does not destroy faith, but it does force us to look at faith as something still alive, albeit still breathing, and capable of healing if we are willing to seek the light before it was redacted. And that path does not begin in ready-made answers. It begins in the silent spaces between translations, where a word was once replaced and a truth has never been fully spoken. And if a single altered word could bend the path of an entire message, then the complete erasure of a gospel, or more accurately, the silencing of an entire parallel theology, was not just a matter of scholarship. It was a fault line across the soul of history, because what we now call Christianity is not the only shape it could have taken. It is a chosen stream carved from a map that once held many rivers, and the question long forbidden from being asked is this: if a different stream had been chosen, where would the sacred pulse of human history have gone? Imagine, if the Gospel of Thomas had been canonized, where every word of Jesus was not a command but a question. Have you discovered who you are? If the Gospel of Mary had never been cut, and the presence of a woman as a voice of divine remembrance had never been denied, if the Gnostic writing, where Christ is not an external judge but the inner light of awakening, had been kept as a parallel depth to the official faith, then perhaps what we now call religion would not have grown into a structure, but remained a current. In that current, there would be no absolute center of authority, no urgent need to standardize rituals or mark the boundaries of right and wrong. Instead, there would be a tradition of listening inwardly, where the soul was not classified as sinner or saved, but gently invited to awaken. Women would not have been erased from the heart of sacred knowing, and Jesus, understood not as a pre-assigned redeemer, but as one who opened a doorway into human consciousness, would become a guide home, not an anchor of judgment. A Christianity like that would not need spires to prove its holiness. It would soak into life like water into earth, quiet, deep, nourishing from within. It would not fear the other, because it never imposed sameness. It would not need to conquer other faiths to justify its own, because it would be spacious enough to hold many voices. Perhaps it would have become a Western form of mysticism, a spiritual stream flowing through the drought of human restlessness. But that stream was not chosen, not because it lacked strength, but because it resisted control. It could not be owned, defined, or handed down through titles. It gave no power to a single throne, and so it was silenced, not through fire, just by letting it settle beneath the dust of time, buried with its scrolls, forgotten with the names of its saints. And yet, when a farmer in Egypt shattered open that clay jar, and when scholars began translating the forgotten words inside, we did not just uncover what was lost, we caught a glimpse of what could have been a sacred world never sealed shut, possibilities that were never born but also never died. And in that moment the past no longer trailed behind us like shadow, it stood before us like a mirror, asking us to reconsider everything we now call obvious. Because sometimes what was once condemned as heresy was not wrong but simply too free, a branch of the future that was never allowed to grow. But when memory returns, and we are quiet enough to listen without intermediaries, then even what was strangled might breathe again, not to overturn, but to remind us. There was once another way to enter the sacred. And though it may no longer be whole, it still waits, in the most silent parts of the soul, and in the memory of a faith that could have taken a very different shape. The woman wasn't just a shadow circling the center. She was the root system, the very ground that once nourished the soul of the tradition. Before institutions were built, before sermons were preached from pulpits or painted onto cathedral ceilings, women were the storytellers, the keepers of light, the ones who held the keys to mysteries not yet carved into doctrine. They didn't wait for permission to speak. They were already speaking from within. And so when religious authority began to crystallize into order, the first voice to be moved out of frame was theirs. Mary Magdalene is a wound history never quite managed to close. In the gospel bearing her name, we don't see the fallen woman in need of saving, as later church tradition insisted. We see someone entrusted to understand things others were never even told. Someone who saw salvation not as a system of laws, but as a journey, through fear, through the dissolving of ego, into the return of the soul to its original light. Beside her stood Thecla, the female disciple, baptized by Paul himself, once preaching with the same authority. But her name too was slowly erased, faded from memory, as if she had never been there. And deeper still is Sophia. Not just a name, not just a figure, but the very embodiment of divine wisdom. The presence of sacred knowing that existed before the world ever did. These names once carried theological weight, but they weren't erased by fire, they were dimmed, a phrase dropped here, an image changed there, a symbol softened into something more manageable. The erasure was subtle, so subtle that later generations came to believe women never had a place in the sacred order, when in truth they had once been its living soul. They weren't forbidden, just retold, in ways that pulled them from the center without anyone noticing. As religion took form under the architecture of male power, even the image of faith itself was reshaped. The feminine role was narrowed down to a single mold, the Virgin Mary, pure, silent, obedient, unteaching, unquestioning. Meanwhile, the Gnostic texts told a very different story, one where women didn't just participate in spirituality, they carried it, not through male intermediaries, but directly. They didn't wait to be acknowledged, they already knew, and that knowing made them harder to control, and therefore dangerous to the rising structures of the age. Losing them wasn't just losing a category of people, it was losing a whole layer of soul. where intuition was once seen as a doorway to the divine, where softness wasn't weakness, but a different form of wisdom. When the feminine was removed, faith lost its inner dialogue, it lost breath. What remained was something rigid, still standing, but no longer alive. And now, if these ancient texts are beginning to surface again, what we're facing isn't just the recovery of women in theology. It's a deeper return to the sacred part of us that had been silenced. The part that listens without needing to argue. The part that understands through feeling, not through hierarchy. These voices are rising now from the basement of collective memory, not to fight history, but to remind us that the sacred has never spoken in only one voice. They don't need to debate. They don't need to reclaim a throne. They just need to be heard between the lines, in the smudged margins, in the faint outlines of figures once almost erased from holy text. Because maybe the human soul was never meant to be half. And only when that hidden half is named again can faith breathe back to life. Not as a structure, but as a sacred current learning how to flow once more after centuries of being held in. And when we are quiet enough to listen, when we are deep enough not to fear what was never charted, then perhaps from the sacred earth, where the soul once breathed in a woman's voice, we might hear that ancient call again. Not from a throne, but from the place where light was once guarded by love, not by power. And in the voice of the woman once silenced, another language begins to speak, and a language not written to prove anything but to reveal. Not the language of doctrine, but of symbol. The Gnostic texts, instead of laying out a clear-cut system of logic, open a labyrinth of images, a map with no straight lines, only depth. They don't say, "Believe this." They hold up fragments of mirrors, inviting the reader to look inward, to piece things together, and gradually glimpse their own spiritual path. In that symbolic world, the serpent is no longer eternally bound to darkness. It becomes the flow of life energy, the pulse of birth, death, and rebirth. It is the origin of awareness, not a fall from grace, but an emergence from blindness. In the Gnostic view, to know is not to sin, it is to awaken. And so the Garden of Eden is no longer a tale of shame, but a question reborn. What if the fall was actually the beginning of freedom? Light, so often promised as a distant reward, is described not as something to be earned, but something already within us. Jesus doesn't bring a new thing. He reminds us the light is within you. The kingdom of heaven isn't far away, waiting beyond death. It's a state of awareness, the ability to see into the heart of things right here in this life. And because of that, every spiritual journey becomes a journey home. Not upward, but inward. Not toward the sky, but toward the sacred within. At the center of it all is Sophia. Not just a feminine figure, but the essence of divine wisdom, the yearning to create and the pain of breaking. Sophia is not all-powerful. She is not unshaken. She falls into the material world, and from that fall, a return begins. In her story, the entire universe is recast as sacred tragedy, where both gods and humans carry the ache of separation and the longing to return. Symbols like the pearl, the vine, the seed, the flame. They're not just poetic images, they're keys to experience, not made to be explained, but to be lived with. The pearl is the core of the soul, the vine, the living thread that binds all spirits, the desert, the silence where we can hear the call. And through each symbol, what awakens isn't knowledge, but a quiet kind of knowing, too deep for words. The Gnostics didn't see the self as something to destroy, but as a fog to pass through, not by force, but by clarity. not by rejecting the body, but by reconciling with it as something sacred too. Their path had no clear steps, only stillness. A quiet long enough for something subtle to emerge like a shaft of light through thick leaves. And it's precisely this openness, this refusal to reduce truth to a single voice, that made symbols inconvenient for any system seeking control. Symbols resist monopoly, they leave no room for dogma. But to the seeker, that very uncertainty becomes real, because only in shadow can the inner light speak freely. So if today these Gnostic writings are being read once more, if these symbols are rising again from the ashes of the past, then maybe what we need isn't to decode them. Maybe we just need to slow down enough to let them open on their own. Not to lead us to another ultimate truth, but to bring us back to something original. A sacredness that once whispered through dreams, through image, through memory, and never truly vanished from the human soul. And if symbols were how the Gnostics passed down light through the dark, then images, what the eyes saw, what the hands touched, became the place where sacred memory was most visibly distorted. This wasn't the quiet shift of words or the subtle redirection of meaning. It was visible action, where every face, every painting, every plastered wall carried the trace of a collective memory that once looked different. There, the sacred had many forms, many voices, many stances, but through time, through power, through the need to systematize belief, those forms were altered. Faces that once shone with spiritual light were pushed back into shadow. Voices that once taught with clarity now appear only as a quiet tilt of the head in the background of a scene. Art restorers, peeling back the thick paint of centuries, have stumbled upon images long buried in patience. A pair of female eyes painted over with a masculine gaze. A hand once raised to teach now folded in passive silence. Names like Mary, Sophia, Thecla, once handwritten in margins, replaced with vague phrases like a disciple. They weren't erased by fire, but by a silence woven into the system, where every brushstroke became a tool of theological revision. Stone statues, ancient mosaics, church walls in Byzantine chapels, Armenian sanctuaries, or Syrian cathedrals, once homes to diverse streams of belief, now bear the marks of a process aimed at unifying all symbols under one truth. And for that one voice to rise, all other voices had to step into the dark. And yet, what once lived is not so easily erased. Beneath every layer of paint lies another layer of memory, and sometimes a shaft of light from some quiet research corner, some overlooked gallery, makes one of those faded faces breathe again. A figure leaning toward Jesus is no longer decorative. She is a companion. A feminine symbol is no longer just background. She once told the very story now claimed by others. Every erased detail whispers the same thing. Someone was here. Just like the ancient texts buried in the desert, these covered images have their own way of whispering. They do not speak, and yet they remain. They may no longer shine, but they shine just enough to make the viewer pause, step back, and ask, why did someone need to hide this? And if this once stood with dignity, maybe it once carried a truth just as profound as what remains. Visual memory does not vanish easily, because once the sacred takes shape, it always leaves a shadow. Even if concealed, that shadow casts itself across the centuries like a question that refuses to fade. And when we truly look, not just to recover a forgotten name, but to see ourselves in a story we were never fully told, we begin to sense what was rerouted, a tradition once silenced, a voice never truly gone. And if today our eyes are learning how to see again, not just through the outermost layer of paint, but through layers of time, of symbol, and of silence, then we may begin to understand the sacred was never truly lost. It has only been waiting for a gaze patient enough, gentle enough, sincere enough to see it again, not to rebuild the old faith, but to restore what was missing. The faces never allowed to stand fully in the light, yet never absent from the shadow. And as the once erased faces begin to reappear, as the long-buried texts are read again under the quiet glow of scholarship, silence, once a tool of control, is no longer an easy refuge. What once belonged only to scholars and quiet seekers has now become part of an open conversation, and the Church is not just a spiritual community, but a power structure that has shaped Western history for over 1,000 years is now forced to face what it once dismissed. Silence can no longer shield it, not when questions are echoing from both outside and within. The reactions come from every side, in varying shades. Some see this as a threat, a danger to the doctrinal structure preserved for centuries as something immovable. They view the Gnostic writings, the apocryphal Gospels, the image of a meditative, inward-facing Jesus as cracks spreading across the carefully laid mortar of orthodoxy. Because if those texts are true, or even just meaningful, then generations have built their faith on something incomplete. But for others, especially many 21st century theologians, it is not a threat. It's an invitation, a chance not to discard the old faith, but to deepen it, a chance to pick up the thread of a once living multivocal tradition and begin weaving it again. For decades, the Vatican's approach has been one of subtle avoidance. It has neither condemned the Nag Hammadi texts nor embraced them. A few scholars were allowed to write under carefully guided terms. Some Protestant denominations rejected it outright, branding it as a new form of heresy. But in leading Catholic universities, conferences on Gnosticism, on Mary Magdalene's forgotten role, and on the political construction of the Bible are drawing larger and larger crowds. In modern monastic circles, these texts are being read not as threats, but as meditations, as a quiet return. This reflects a truth that can no longer be ignored. The Church is no longer a monolithic, unquestioned body. Inside it, two silent currents are flowing. One clings to a fixed definition of faith like a fortress. The other begins digging wells in moving downward, inward, listening for echoes from deeper ground. And in between those two, millions of believers are beginning to ask, is what I believe the truth, or simply the version of truth that was chosen for me? And if it was chosen, what was left out? The admissions don't come all at once, but they are coming in cautious remarks, in footnotes, in peer-reviewed studies quietly funded by official sources. There's growing recognition that perhaps some texts were misunderstood, that the role of women may have been far more central than the record suggests, that what we now call orthodox may have emerged more from political decisions than divine inspiration. These admissions are small, fragile, easy to miss, but like the first crack in a wall, long untouched, they let in the light. And when that light enters, it doesn't come to tear the temple down. It simply asks if faith is a living journey, a hunger to understand, a trembling before something larger than ourselves, then how can it stand still? How can it ignore what was left behind if what was lost still carries the seed of something sacred? Maybe what's happening now isn't collapse, but layering, like the Earth's strata, where every century leaves behind a layer of sediment, every decision an imprint. And now, as deeper layers are touched again, faith is not broken, it is widened, not a replacement faith, but one with depth. Not to deny what is, but to make it more real, more human, more alive. And maybe, in the quiet tremors of this moment, a new kind of faith is forming. Not one built on absolutes, but on the courage to look back, a faith willing to remember what was forgotten, and from that memory continue forward, not as one who repeats, but as one who carries it onward. And as the Church begins to acknowledge the cracks in what once seemed a seamless mosaic of doctrine, an old question, long buried beneath the ashes of time, slowly begins to rise again. Why is one truth never enough? Not to challenge belief, and certainly not to destroy it, but to widen it, to return to faith the softness it once had, the breath that once made it alive, because perhaps the sacred was never found in absolutes, but in the capacity to hold many ways of seeing. From the very beginning, Christian faith was never written by a single hand. It was a harmony of many voices from many communities, each offering a glimpse of the same figure, Jesus. In one gospel, he is the light within. In another, the Saviour from above. Some wrote his words like whispered koans, simple but deep. Others told of miracles as signs of divine power. Each telling was a doorway, each vision a way the human soul tried to touch something greater than reason. But then history chose a path, and as with all paths that become institutionalized, it had to trim away the side trails, the texts that didn't conform, the images that couldn't be controlled, the depths that couldn't be turned into law, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. You can't distill ambiguity into commandments. You can't build a cathedral on things that refuse to be defined. And so those other paths, those real choices once available, were named heresy, error, and over time, forgotten. Now as the Gnostic writings are being read again, from Thomas to Philip, from Mary to Judas, what we're facing is not a threat, but an awakening, not a rebellion, but a wider sky. What was once pushed outside turns out to be the missing part of a story that was never complete to begin with. Words once labelled false now reveal a different beauty, a different depth, and they don't replace what we already have, but they give it weight. They don't fight for the center, they simply remind us the center was never singular, and in that expansion faith begins to breathe again, no longer a declaration but a search, no longer I know but I'm listening. A journey that doesn't end with an answer but starts again with the forgotten questions. The sacred is no longer a frozen statue on an altar. It becomes a presence you can speak with, something that's always been there, if we are humble enough to approach it and patient enough to stay. Because perhaps for faith to truly live, it doesn't need a candle. It needs a sky where many stars can shine, where light and shadow do not fight, but coexist to create depth. And if we dare to open our hearts to the voices once silenced, we might also learn to listen for the sacred within ourselves, where truth has no fixed face but countless doors, each one opening to its own path, and all, if followed deep enough, lead toward light. And if light still flickers through the thick layers of dust laid down by time, it's not the miracle of stone or parchment, but the quiet persistence of hands, of hearts, of both known and nameless souls who refuse to let memory fade into silence. These texts, these fragile scrolls, these crumbling pages, these once condemned words, exist today only because someone, somewhere, once decided this is worth keeping, even if no one might read it, even if no one might believe. Who were they? They were the quiet Gnostics of the 2nd century. Not fleeing in rebellion, but in reverence. They copied each line not to spread, but to preserve, as one would cup their hands around a flickering flame when night begins to fall. They knew their words might never be read, but still they wrote. They did not need to win, they just needed not to disappear. They were the Coptic monks of Egypt, who didn't need to understand every symbol to recognize what they held was sacred. They transcribed not for glory, not for position. They simply wrote as if breathing, to keep the words from going silent. As if they believed that sometimes life doesn't need to be fully understood, it just needs not to go out. They were the farmer in 1945 who dug into the ground at Nag Hammadi, not in search of doctrine, but while tending his crops. He didn't know his hands had opened a door, history had slammed shut, but he didn't burn everything, he didn't throw it away, and because of that the world was forced to look again at what it once chose to forget. They were scholars like Elaine Pagels, Marvin Meyer, Bart Ehrman, not writing to tear down but to listen, not painting halos but refusing silence. They read what had been cast aside, not to elevate it above all, but to return it to its rightful place, a part of humanity's sacred memory that never should have been missing. And they were also the ones without names. The readers with no degrees, no microphones, no conferences, just someone who sat quietly long after finishing the Gospel of Mary. Someone who sighed at a difficult line in Thomas but felt a sudden widening in the heart. Someone for whom simply continuing to read was already an act of bravery, in a world so used to ready-made answers. It was they who kept the thread from breaking, that fragile line between centuries, stretched to its limits, hidden, mislabeled, buried in dust, but not cut, because someone, just one person, decided not to let go, and perhaps the sacred never needed crowds to survive. Just one person reading under a dim lamp, one soul that doesn't flinch when faith begins to tremble, one heart willing to ask, if this was once part of me, do I have the courage to remember? And because of people like that, this story continues, not in the ringing of church bells, but in the quiet stirrings of the human heart. Not in golden temples, but in the soft-lit silence of a soul that still knows how to listen. And then one day, the old words, long buried beneath parched soil, beneath crumbling walls, beneath libraries that once burned red into the sky, began to breathe. Not with noise, not with any claim to a throne, but with a whisper. Just enough of a whisper for those who still knew how to listen, to feel something stir within. They did not return with banners or proclamations. They came quietly through the softest of pathways. A class on comparative religion in a small university tucked away in Scandinavia, where students read the Gospel of Thomas as if uncovering a forgotten book of ancient meditation. A midnight podcast where the host reads the Gospel of Philip in a low, steady voice, not to preach, but to call the listener gently back to the center of themselves. A small publisher in California reprinting the Gnostic texts not for profit, but because it felt like a spiritual debt that had waited long enough. And in a mountain-top monastery, a Zen teacher opens a meditation session not with a line from Buddhist sutras, but from a Gnostic text. Whoever comes to know themselves will understand everything. No one finds it strange, because in that quiet place the boundaries between religions have dissolved into stillness. An old professor in Paris sits among ancient books, no longer eager to debate, only to listen again to words he once dismissed as heresy. A young student in Seoul encounters Mary Magdalene not as a sinner forgiven, but as a deep teacher of the soul. An artist in Mexico puts aside Baroque images of Christ and begins to search for the erased faces from ancient mosaics, as if art itself could restore a stolen memory. The miracle is this: these old words don't need to be proven, they don't need to rival the Bible, they don't need to become the new truth. They only need to be touched, sincerely, quietly, by the heart of someone who longs to understand. And in that moment, they come alive. Not through sermons, but through presence. Through the quiet resonance, they awaken inside the reader. No system can govern that kind of understanding. No authority can dictate what happens in the moment. Someone reads the words and the kingdom is within you and realizes, wow, I've always known this. I just forgot. These texts do not seek a seat in the church. They do not crave devotion. They only ask for a small space in the heart of someone aching to be understood, in a mind weary of dogmatic walls, in a soul that has never quite felt safe inside rigid definitions. They come not to replace, but to complete. And when they live again in this way, quietly, freely, without force, what was once erased is no longer the trace of a dead past. It becomes another layer of the present, a parallel current, a whisper beneath every sermon, a quiet presence beneath every ritual. And we, people who thought we had long since walked away from faith, in this noisy, glittering 21st century, suddenly begin to hear that whisper again, as if we ourselves, somewhere deep in time, once asked these questions and then forgot. And now the time has come to return silently, to pick them up, and to walk forward again, but this time with the parts we once left behind. And when the final lines fall silent, when the quiet reading fades like smoke into a misty morning, something else arrives, not with sound, not with words, but with a stillness as soft as the final breath of a memory that was never named. Silence. Not the silence of forgetting, but the silence of something sacred, and that never needed words. In all the Gnostic writings, from the Gospel of Thomas to Mary, from Philip to Sophia, there is always something strange. The missing lines, the broken passages, the empty spaces between thoughts, as if the writers themselves knew that something cannot be written down. And it is exactly there, in what is not said, that life still pulses. As if the purpose was never to explain but to open, not to fill but to awaken. Maybe the ancients believed that what is deepest cannot be taught, it can only be felt through presence, through a stillness where the mind no longer struggles but slowly sinks into deeper waters of itself. A state where language is only the shell, and truth moves like a breeze across the skin, wordless and complete. This silence is a language no one teaches, yet everyone once knew. It's the space that appeared when Mary looked into the empty tomb and saw nothing, yet understood everything. It's the moment Judas stepped out of that final room, his unspeaking gaze carrying both betrayal and freedom. It's the hand of a scribe trembling at the final word, knowing the page may soon be burned, but still writing, because the sacred does not lie in preservation, but in the act of being laid down. Because of that silence, the sayings in these texts carry an uncanny weight. They do not argue, they do not command, they do not plead, they simply whisper, "Let the one who has ears listen." Not with ears, but with a quiet emotion where you no longer need to fully understand and begin to embrace mystery as a part of truth. Maybe the most enduring thing left by these forgotten texts isn't in the ink, but in the spaces between, like music living in the rests, like prayer breathing in the pause before a word, like a look that knows without speaking, a form of transmission that has no shape and yet feels more present than any sermon ever spoken. We live in a world of noise, of endless debate, of closed definitions, of faith measured by right and wrong. But perhaps those early writers, those quiet architects of forgotten gospels, never meant to win any argument. They were not trying to convince. They were simply searching for a deeper way of seeing. And they chose silence as the final shelter, for what they knew could not be owned. And if we today are still enough to stop, to pause in the middle of a world that runs, to pause between the question and the answer. Then maybe we too will begin to hear, not a sound, but a presence. Something that does not speak aloud, that does not demand belief, but gently makes itself known. As if we have touched something deeply true, something that was never lost, it just never spoke in words. And then, after everything, when the dust of time settles like the hush that follows a long rain, we look back, and the words are still there. Not gleaming, not complete, not declaring absolute truths. They remain like faint footprints on damp earth, not to point the way, but to remind us that someone once walked here. And that in itself is enough to move the heart. For these hidden texts never came to flood the mainstream. They arrived like underground springs beneath stone, slow, quiet, but impossible to stop. The Gospel of Mary does not argue with Matthew. Thomas does not oppose Mark. Philip does not seek to replace Luke. Judas does not destroy John. Each text is not a rebuttal. It is a reflection, another telling, another lens, a parallel path leading toward the same ungraspable mystery. They do not reject Scripture. They simply open windows that may have been shut for too long. Out of fear, the wind might disturb us. And in that breeze, what we thought was dead begins to breathe again. Not loudly, not demanding recognition, but like dew on a leaf after rain, softening the ground long hardened by layers of fixed definitions. Perhaps faith was never meant to be a stone building, with high walls, locked gates, and a single road. Perhaps it was always meant to be a garden, where all shapes grow, some rising toward light, some crawling low, some clear as lotus petals, some tangled like roots. And in that mess, life becomes real. When these ancient writings are read again, not to argue, but to listen, what emerges is not only history, it is something deeply personal. A part of us that once felt lost beneath rigid answers now feels seen. A part that thought faith was only for the obedient now realizes it too has been invited, not to follow blindly, but to walk freely. Honestly, no one has to understand every symbol, no one is required to agree, but simply knowing that these words exist, or it is enough to change how we look at the sky. Hearing that someone once felt the sacred in a different way is enough to open a quiet space within, a space no one else can build for us, but no one can close either. And when we stand in that space, after the long rain, the world feels newly rinsed. Everything pauses, the leaves are still wet, the earth still smells alive. Nothing is too clear, but nothing is hidden. It is the moment between two worlds, between what was and what is coming, a moment that rarely lasts, but once felt is never forgotten. That moment is the sacred, not because it is dramatic, but because it is true. So true it needs no explanation, only to be lived. And if there is a gift these ancient texts leave behind, it is this, an invitation to step into a truth that does not hold still, a truth that does not promise escape but walks beside us, a faith that does not bind but opens. So yes, the road ahead is still long. There are things we may never understand, passages we may never decode, but now our steps are no longer afraid, not because we know everything, but because we've stopped fearing the unknown. For the sacred was never waiting at the end of the road. It has always been in the walking, when we walk slowly, walk deeply, and walk in silence. That voice is still there, faint but steady, as if echoing from the quiet center of our own being. Keep going. You don't need to know. You only need to keep listening.